Hi guys. Tonight I have the second part of my conversation with Tom Worrell. Um, in this episode, we continue on from libertarianism and focus a little bit more on nationalism. I hope you enjoyed the last episode. If you did, you'll certainly be in for a treat in this episode. As always, Tom makes some great points and is really a very educated, erudite, and knowledgeable person on many of these subjects, and I'm glad to have him on my podcast every time. So, with no further ado, here's part two of my conversation with Tom Worrell. Hi guys, and welcome to Radio Visca. Today I have with me my good friend Tom Worrell, and we are continuing our debate or our discussion about the differences, the benefits of libertarianism and ethno-nationalism. I think we've in our previous episode, previous debate, we sort of took apart libertarianism a little bit and looked at the benefits of it, the positive aspects to it, and where it falls down. We looked at some of the contradictions in libertarian philosophy as well. We started talking about nationalism and more from an aspect of how weak it really is today, but in this day and age. But I think we might want to get into some of the benefits of nationalism and some of the justifications for nationalism today. So with that, I'll hand over to Tom, who's prepared a little bit of an argument, first defining ethno-nationalism and then justifying it, really.
Okay, thank you. In the previous video, at the beginning we kind of set out some definitions in terms of what classical liberalism or what libertarianism is, and we also vaguely touched on the idea that nationalism can mean a number of different things. For example, you can have a civic nationalism which isn't based on ethnicity, but you can also have a tribalistic or ethnic nationalism. And I thought it might be useful, if we're going to compare libertarianism with nationalism, to actually sort of take some of the principles out and get some definitions. So just in the terms of the word nation, that actually, I believe, it comes from the word nation meaning birth. So traditionally, that would either refer to the homeland in which someone is born into, or the tribe. So it could, traditionally, it was common to refer to the nations of Europe, not necessarily the countries, but the different ethnic groups within Europe. And I think
it comes from Greek or Latin, or
one of the two.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I think so. There are a number of sort of tenets to most nationalism. I've got 6 written down, and I'll just run over what I believe those are, and then go into a bit more detail. So firstly, you've got the idea of a preservation either of a nation or of an ethnic group as a fundamental driving principle. Secondly, you've got more of a particularist moral approach. So it's a rejection of a universalist sort of humanitarian approach to morality, and more of a focus on the success or preservation of one group. Third, you've got a focus usually on generosity in terms of social policy or values. Another one is that you've got kind of a recognition of conflict between different groups that occurs, throughout the animal kingdom, but particularly within mankind. You've got a localism as opposed to a globalism, and within some forms of nationalism, you've also got an imperialistic or supremacist tendency, not within all, but within some. So going back to the first one, that preservation of a group as a universal approach. So that's the idea that a group's culture, race, or heritage has inherent value and should be preserved and sustained. So in a sense, you could talk about saving whales or saving certain species within nature. And the nationalists might say, well, mankind also has these divisions, and each of those divisions is worthy of credit and value. So, for example, some people might argue that the Palestinians are losing their traditions, they're losing their culture, they're losing their home. It would appear to be a universal value to support the creation of a Palestinian state, and for them to be able to have their own land in which they can continue the continue the culture and traditions of their ancestors.
Right.
And that, you know, many nationalists would apply that to all peoples on earth, including, I don't know, it could be Native American tribes, it could be you know, Gandhi and his nationalist movement in India, but equally it could be the native peoples of Europe.
Right.
Now, we often, that approach to preservation, or an ethnically based universal type of nationalism based on the inherent value of different cultures, and its connection to ethnicity is applauded for some people. But these days it's also derided for some people, particularly Europeans. Europeans aren't allowed to, or it's not politically correct for Europeans to have that, to apply that universal preservationism to themselves. Moving on to the second sort of tenet of nationalism, that's more of it often tends to be a particularist to one geographical area or group. So the driving fundamental principle behind it is a kind of collectivism based on what is good for this particular group. How can we act collectively together in order to further our own interests, improve our society, and increase our power and strength and resource? I think, and that can vary from country to country. So, for example, I think, you know, Franco is an example of a nationalist who won the civil war in Spain, and I've got a quote from him here which says that nationalism, or fascism for him, quote, presents wherever it manifests itself characteristics which are varied to the extent that countries and national temperaments vary. It is essentially a defensive reaction of the organism, a manifestation of the desire to live, of the desire not to die, which at certain times seizes a whole people. So each people reacts in its own way, according to its conception of life. Our rising here has a Spanish meaning. So in a sense there, Franco is pointing out the fact that nationalism amongst different groups is going to be quite different, depending on the cultures, traditions, and history of a particular people.
No, that's very interesting, because obviously Spain as a concept, it's not, you know, a brand new concept, but there's obviously this history of the Catalonians and the Basque people, and there's certainly some divisions between, I believe there's a name for the sort of people from Madrid as well. I can't remember it now, but it's something with A, I believe. So really, Spain has different tribal groups, right? And these tribal groups are really somewhat in opposition to each other. There's a sort of Catalonian nationalism, right, where secessionist nationalism. So how would you, you know, not to sort of go on too much of a tangent, but it kind of interests me in this context. How would you reconcile that? Or how do you think Franco reconciled that? And what would, you know, a Spanish nationalist answer to that be?
I think that's right, and I can't speak for Spanish nationalists, but I agree that within any form of political ideology or state that's based on either ethnicity or a geographical region, there are always going to be, as you point out, kind of some sort of logical or factual inconsistencies. So there's going to be rivalries between the groups within that society. You might have predominance of one sort of ethnicity in one area and one in another. You might have different cultures or traditions within those different peoples. You might have had a history of migration into one part and not another. So you're right, it's difficult to define something objectively in terms of a nation, because there's often going to be sort of grey lines around what that actually is. But I think, I mean, I'm not an expert, but I think in terms of Spain, one particular driver behind the fascists in the Civil War was the preservation of a Catholic identity and the religious structure to the society, which was in direct opposition to communism, which was secularist and atheist.
Right.
I'm not sure about what other drivers might be.
I mean, it was also centered around Catalonia, right? The uprising, from memory. I'm not sure if at that time there was an ethnic component to it.
Yeah.
But it may have been, part of the underlying motivation of a lot of people, right? The sort of secessionist drive. But I mean, that's a tangent, and but it's definitely something I think I might bring up later in terms of nationalism, because I think we can actually find nations where that problem doesn't exist on Earth. Iceland, for example. Or you have Norway, or although Norway does have different regions, but Denmark. I think that there are pure ethno-states that also don't have these kind of regional divisions. But yeah, so that was just something I wanted to ask you.
Thanks. And going on with some of the principles behind nationalism, and that I perceive, and I'm sure that there are many that are probably missed out, but in terms of comparing it with libertarianism, nationalism tends to be very much more of a collectivist rather than a traditionalist approach to political philosophy or political beliefs, by which I mean the idea of a nation being many individuals coming together to form to have a collective common identity or a collective purpose, rather than an individual drive for non-aggression within society and property rights. So a nationalist society will usually have a government which plays a central role in monitoring banking, trade, production and labour activity, whereas libertarianism tends towards free markets and less state control, although they're not always diametrically opposed. For example, in many nationalist type governments, there's still an element of free market activity.
Right. Yeah.
That's the regulations are often focused around whether or not that economic activity is good for that nation, rather than necessarily as much for corruption or influence from external corporations or capital.
I mean, the United States is a fairly libertarian yet fairly nationalistic country. At least it was in the past, right?
Yeah.
In the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. And another tenet of nationalism which opposes modern leftism in many ways is a focus on sort of social hierarchy and kind of generacy. So traditionally nationalist governments promoted strong family units. They were against things like promiscuity, promoted traditional roles for men and women, encouraged healthy activities, and embraced traditional culture like, music and dance and so forth, above what you have now within modern leftism, which is really the promotion of different types of family units, support for the single parent family, and in some ways the kind of appraisal of it, or the holding up of single parents as heroes. There's also a lot in the media now which promotes degeneracy in terms of social activity. Lots of drugs or drinking are often glorified, and promiscuity is often glorified within the media, whereas traditionalist sort of nationalist governments would certainly stamp down upon that, by which I mean maybe more looking towards make a kind of more of Islamic fundamentalist nationalists. And also if you look back at some of the policies within Europe, like for example in Germany or within Spain, a lot of that kind of what we say degeneracy was actually quite heavily censored.
Right. I mean, even if you look at Russia today, actually, there's a sort of, well, I think they recently banned Pornhub, I think, right? And then there's sort of law against propaganda, homosexual propaganda towards minors, and there's a clear, Putin has actually stated this explicitly, that he's trying to get the birth rate in ethnically Russian areas to increase, and apparently it has now for 4 years running, which would be one of the few countries in Europe above replacement rates than in white areas, I believe. So I think Russia may actually be a good example of a, not ethno-nationalist, because they have a lot of different ethnicities, but at least a sort of civic nationalist country.
Yeah,
sort of under this umbrella of the sort of Russian identity, which, similar to Spain, with the Basques and the Catalonians and so on, it has several different. In Russia, there's far more ethnicities than just 3 or 4, but it still seems to somehow function on that. As a sort of there's this larger idea of the Russian family, right? And in the Russian case, it's only, well, I would say that the racial or the tribalistic, the ethnic component is, I don't think it's non-existent, but it's downplayed a little bit. And I think Russia in that regard is a very special case, because I think Russia as it exists today has almost always been multi-ethnic, ever since its inception, right? It's been such a vast empire going way back, and had all the Siberian sort of Inuit people, and then also some of the Islamic people to the south in its territory, way before we had this modern migration. And so I was just watching an episode of Putin interviews by Oliver Stone, and that's a point Putin makes, is that unlike almost any other nation on earth, the multiplicity of ethnicities in Russia is a result of history, not a result of immigration. So in other words, these people have always lived in that area. Whether that is going to work long term or not is another question, though, and that's really, I guess, where my line of questioning is going with Spain, is the sort of, where do we draw this distinction in the nation, in the peoples, right? Like, and Great Britain, is another great case with Scotland and England and Ireland. That for me is a sort of a tricky aspect to nationalism.
Yeah.
Have you thought about that at all? Or?
As you said that, I think it's probably fair to say that more of a civic nationalism, or a nationalism that ignores the differences, the grey areas between different ethnic groups in a country, can be used to, achieve certain goals by maybe a ruling elite,
right,
of a particular country. And
so you're saying you're saying that Great Britain shouldn't actually be one unified kingdom, so to speak.
Well,
under nationalism.
I really don't know, because I haven't thought it through, but I can see what you're saying in terms of the inconsistencies. And I mean, I'm not necessarily making an argument for ethno-nationalism here.
Right,
I'm trying to define it. And I think there are always going to be exceptions to, if you define an ethnicity or a nation, there are always going to be grey areas. There are always going to be ways that things or people or elements of the culture which don't fit within that particular framework, particularly nowadays when you've got so much multiculturalism all across the world.
So, I mean, the modern argument that I've heard, and you can let me know what you think about it, is that it's really, we're in a globalized world, we're past tribes, and we're really down to race. So it's really, are you white or not? Or are you Asian or not? Are you Chinese or not? Sinoid, or I don't know what the racial term for the Asian, I guess, is the term, right? Although I find that a very vague term. I've always had problems with the term Asian because it involves Israelis and Japanese. It's like such a vast continent, right? And there's actually a lot of white Asians in that, if you wanted to take it geographically, because most of Eastern Russia is in Asia. So, but what I've heard as an argument, in response to what I just said, is, well, you've got the Basques, you've got the Bavarians, you've got the Prussians, you've got the Scots, you've got the Englishes. Well, really it comes down to race in this day and age. And so it's almost like we're talking about a new kind of nationalism that's emerging on the internet, at least, right? It's sort of when the beginning stages of a sort of global racial nationalism almost, right? And I think that applies to other ethnicities as well, not just Europeans. I think similar things are happening with Chinese, because you have Chinese living in Indonesia, in Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Australia, Canada, increasingly, where I think there it doesn't have to develop yet. It just is already, right? I mean, I don't think the Chinese in San Francisco or in Vancouver or in Sydney see themselves as like, well, you know, which tribe are we? You know, like, are we like, no, we're Chinese, right? Like there's that sort of lack of, you know, cultural Marxism indoctrination, which is interesting because it used to be a communist country. But I think Chinese, they just have such an ancient history that they just know who they are, right? But interestingly, maybe 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case, right? There would have been, you know, these guys, and the Han, and the guys to the north, and guys to the west, the guys to the south. And I mean, we still have that division with the various dialects like Mandarin and Cantonese, and I believe Hokkien is another one, or Hokkien or something like that. And even today, you still have Taiwan and Hong Kong, Macau. I mean, there's still some Singapore. There's still some political and ethnic and tribal differences, but it's all under the banner of Chinese, right? There's no debate on whether they're Chinese or not. They all understand themselves as Chinese, and they are Chinese, and no matter where they move. So is that maybe where Europeans, whites, are moving in the 21st century? With nationalism as an ideology.
I haven't seen any studies on the popularity of ethno-nationalism in terms of a broader-based European identity, and there does appear to be some emergence of that, at least online, and amongst certain groups online. I think that could probably be connected back to one of the more traditional tenets of nationalism, which was a recognition of difference, or a recognition perhaps sometimes of conflict between different groups, and that could be religious groups, as you mentioned, but it could also be ethnic groups, it could be politically motivated groups. So a nationalist, nationalists traditionally may have come to the conclusion that there would be less conflict if a particular geographical area had a number of, or the large majority of people of one particular ethnic group or religion, because many conflicts on Earth are actually derived from on the basis of ethnicity or religion or belief system. So that recognition of conflict and difference could drive, more of a resurgence of nationalism, particularly in countries where conflicts are becoming more and more readily noticeable. I mean, for instance, the emergence of increased terror across Europe. You can see it's quite obvious that a lot of the terrorism comes from people motivated by Islam, and naturally nationalists within those countries are going to say, well, if Muslim people weren't in this country, then this violence wouldn't have happened, and use that those events as an evidence to support their argument to say that actually we should have a generally monocultural and mono-ethnic society if we're going to have a peaceful society with conflict.
Because I mean, ethnicity and culture basically go together, right? I mean, you have the outliers of the mixed race kid, or the sort of the Indian kid that loves classical music or whatever. By and large, those are exceptions, I believe, right? Where you can make the generalization that culture and ethnicity are largely synonymous, or go hand in hand at least. Because yes, you do have the English converts to Islam, but how long are they really going to stay English, right? Because they'll probably marry someone Islamic who unlikely to be white, British, so they'll be sort of absorbed into the larger Middle Eastern kind of ethnicity pot, so to speak, right? So and I think this is an interesting aspect of modern multicultural society that people on the left are absolutely unwilling to accept. This idea that ethnicity and culture kind of go hand in hand.
I think it's important to approach it not as a matter of ideology. We're not, if someone was to make an argument for nationalism and say people behave differently. People with from different racial backgrounds, by and large, as groups, can be seen to behave differently, or people with different belief systems behave differently. A leftist may say, no, all people are equal, it's just a matter of upbringing and environment and oppression. But the important thing to take account of is the actual empirical evidence. Now, we know that it's relatively controversial, but a lot of people adhere to the differences between race and IQ. A lot of the text seems to show that certain people from different parts of the world come up in terms of their ability to reason and use logic to resolve problems. There is a significant difference between the outcomes in tests between different ethnic groups. The Japanese nearly always come out on top, whereas different ethnic groups are at the bottom. Those stats suggest that within any society, if there is different groups of people, the outcomes by and large for those people are going to be different based on the IQ. Another point is the statistics on race and crime. So, for example, particularly in the US and also across Europe, you have certain ethnic groups who appear to have a greater propensity to commit certain types of violent crime. Again, the leftists might say, well, no, that's due to oppression and so forth. But the evidence in itself, using Occam's razor, which is to draw the easiest and most logical conclusion from the data, suggests that certain racial groups do appear to have a greater tendency to commit crime. Therefore, a nationalist might argue that, again, a homogeneous society of people who have a lower tendency to commit crime or perhaps have a higher IQ is going to create better outcomes for that nation in general.
So we could just import a whole bunch of Japanese people.
Well, I mean, if we're looking purely in terms of lower crime and also things like higher productivity or higher skilled groups, then yes, that would be a good approach to, I don't know, making a better economy, making a safer society.
Although I have heard that the only Japanese that emigrate, because that's not a very common thing for Japanese to emigrate, right? The only Japanese that emigrate disgraced Yakuza. Right. So we might be getting the actual bottom feeders.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, you're right, because what you've done there is you've compared one of the national tendencies, which is the preservation of a particular cultural heritage as a principle, but then there's kind of a contradiction between that and nationalism as a recognition of conflict between different groups. If you say so, I mean, even if you were, say, if you were from an ethnic group which had a lower average IQ, or where there was appeared to be a particularly high crime rate within that ethnic group in comparison to others, a nationalist of that ethnic group would still want to preserve their society, culture and heritage, and not have migration of people from other ethnic groups with perhaps higher IQ.
Yeah, and I mean, this especially average high IQ would be especially threatening, really, wouldn't it? And I mean, I think one good example that we may bring up in that case is, this sort of, I mean, from a historical, this is sort of a darling of the left, right? The sort of oppression of the Native Americans, or the Inuit, the Native Canadians, or the oppression of the Native South Americans, or the oppression of the Aboriginals in Australia. But another way to look at this is simply the IQ difference, right? And I think this is particularly acute in Australia, where I think Aboriginals generally in these IQ tests test as the lowest, basically globally, right? Now, do they have certain capabilities that maybe other people don't have, that may be more attuned to certain aspects of the Australian landscape, the heat, the weather, the sort of type of nature that they evolved in? Probably yes, but when it comes to things like reasoning and speech and mathematics and economics and probably to a large degree also self-control, as in discipline, right? Which may not be that necessary in a warm environment, if you evolve in a very warm environment, right? I think they have clear disadvantages over Europeans and probably over Asians as well, in comparison to Asians as well. So, there's the interesting pro-nationalist argument in that can be found is that, well, look at what happened to the Aboriginals when they did let all these foreigners in, right? Now, there's not only the IQ aspect, there's also the numerical aspect, right? I believe even, before before the first British ships landed in Australia, there was, I think, less than 1 million Aboriginals. I mean, that's what I've heard. I certainly don't think that, Australia had like tens of millions of Aboriginal population. I'd have to look into this exactly, but my understanding is that it was less than 1 million population in the entire continent of Australia, which makes sense because the majority of Australia is desert. So you've suddenly got immigrants that in the tens of millions, really, right? I mean, I think Australia went up to 10 million relatively quickly. So they were completely numerically replaced as well. So even if there had been no IQ difference, they basically had no chance, right? And you don't even need to refer to oppression or expropriation or genocide or any of these things, which, in my understanding, in Australia was nowhere near as violent as it was in North America, for example. There was simply just not enough people, and the country was too vast to really have this kind of widespread warfare. I think in Tasmania there was some, but it pretty much was limited to that. So you're really looking at a situation where just pure numbers are a threat to, and nobody would argue that Aboriginals in Australia have no ability to live there by their own culture or live by their own traditions or maintain their culture, but they obviously have significant problems brought about by not being able to deal with many of the things that Western culture entails, like alcohol, for example, or regular work and those kind of things. So, and this is when you face a relatively enlightened, relatively universalist empire like the British Empire. Now, I think the argument in Europe goes is that the people that are now numerically superior to the Europeans, i.e. the Africans and the Middle Easterners, I think white Europeans number around something like 350 to 400 million. And certainly if you look at it per nation basis, it's far less, right? I mean, Denmark has 9 million people, Norway has 5 million people, Ireland has 5 million people, France is something like 50 million. I mean, none of these numbers match with, Nigeria, which is 200 million, or the Middle East in general, which I think is around 500 million. Africa as a whole, I think, is projected to be 3 billion in a few years, 10, 20 years. So the big difference there, of course, is regardless of IQ, numerically, there's again a huge imbalance, really, and an ever increasing imbalance as well as far as birth rates go. But not only that, the cultures from which these people are coming are not the sort of British Empire, universalist, Christian, enlightened sort of, civilized, really, societies. So there's no guarantee that should these migrants obtain numerical superiority, they would even allow Europeans the sort of cultural, leftovers that Aboriginals have today in Australia, or Canadian Native Americans have, for that matter. It may be that even that is too much. And certainly if you look at ISIS or the Taliban, their tendency tends to be to destroy artifacts of previous civilizations. Now, obviously they're extreme, but even if you look at Constantinople versus Istanbul, right? I mean, the actual Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, right? As soon as Constantinople fell. So I think there's maybe, regardless of all the ideology and all the sort of that there's just simply this practical danger looming now that you don't even need to justify with IQ or crime or like it's just so overwhelmingly obvious in the numbers that you hardly even need to make an argument for it. I mean, I think that's really where a lot of these a lot of the nationalism is gaining its energy from now, despite what the mainstream media is trying to really indoctrinate people into believing.
Yeah, I think it's natural for any people when threatened with demographic replacement to band together, or at least argue for the preservation of their own people and their society. It doesn't matter who, any people on Earth would do that, and naturally that's going to happen in Europe and other traditionally European majority countries as the demographics change. I mean, this highlights one of the fundamental weaknesses, I believe, within the libertarian approach, which is that people tend to have different ideologies and belief systems which depend upon, to a certain extent, their ethnicity. So, for example, if you did want to be a free market libertarian or classical liberal, and you were to join one of those groups or one of the parties like the Tea Party in the US or the Libertarians, you would find that it's almost entirely populated of white males. In fact, it only seems to be white males who want freedom to that extent.
What about the women? The women don't want freedom?
Well, there aren't as many members or proponents of libertarianism amongst the female population.
Interesting.
So it's a matter of fact that freedom seems to depend upon, to a certain extent, biology or the drive for. Now, some libertarians might argue that other people from around the world just aren't aware of, libertarian philosophy and would easily change their mind. But libertarian philosophy has been around for a couple of hundred years now, and not much has changed. If anything, there are probably less people who believe in freedom potentially now than before. And another point following on from that, which comes back to your point about demographic replacement and the threat to Western societies. Now, if it's mostly white males who want freedom, it stands to reason that with the ongoing demographic changes in the West, the amount of liberty in terms of what people are prepared to vote for or sustain is going to decrease. A few interesting studies show that people from places like Asia and Africa tend to be actually much more ethnocentric than people from Europe. I think there was one global study looking at several hundred countries around the world, where different questions were asked. For example, would you like to have a next door neighbour who's a different race than you? It tended to be the white European, particularly Northern European countries, who are the most open to having a multicultural society.
Do you remember at all what that study was called? Or
I've got the notes somewhere. I'll have to send them to you. But it's a fairly well known study. I believe their articles. The Telegraph published that article.
All right. Yeah.
And
Telegraph,
I mean, look at the. I think it's something like racism by nation.
Right.
And one of the key questions,
because they had to use that word racism, didn't they?
I think so. But it's one of the key questions is, would you like to have a neighbour who's of a different race, or how open would you be to that? And the countries that came out worse were, I believe, India and I think Sudan, which gives some evidence to the fact that it suggests that different racial groups appear to be more or less open to multicultural society.
But is that maybe just indoctrination, right?
I think that certainly a leftist would argue that that's more to do with cultural acclimatization and perhaps the fact that they hadn't been exposed to foreign groups on the one hand. On the other hand, there did appear to be there is evidence in the West that people from different ethnic groups, and particularly migrant groups, will vote for people of their own ethnicity,
right?
Based upon largely, apparently, their ethnicity rather than necessarily what they say. They feel like instinctively, if they've got someone of their own ethnicity representing them, then that person will act in their favour.
So do you think with Europeans that this is sort of, so to get back to that comment that's maybe a leftist argument, but I don't think I'm making that point from a leftist point of view. I'm basically trying to make the point that Europeans have been exposed to so much sort of equality and diversity propaganda, so as it were, there's been so much training essentially that obviously when you now question Europeans, they're going to skew towards that sort of, you know, universalist, generous approach, even in their potentially anonymous, non-tracked answers. So in other words, I don't know how this questionnaire was undertaken, but it's possible that at least some percentage of the people are answering the way they think they should answer, out of fear of social repercussions. I mean, there's an official questionnaire, right? And then there's the other possibility that a large amount of people simply have been indoctrinated well enough to believe that way or to think that way. And so potentially it's not actually a genetically, ethnically European trait. It's simply something that's been indoctrinated into people over the last, 50 years. Because I think if you look back at history, I think the Europeans potentially were quite xenophobic, quite unwilling to have people even of a different religious denomination, be it Christian or like Catholic or Protestant, living next door. And there was a lot of, maybe people today call brother wars, right? So, in Spain, we spoke about Spain earlier, there's all that rivalry in Catalonia. So maybe to some extent, those results are, a result of indoctrination and also of social pressure, right? I mean, there's the interesting, an interesting recent example is all the polls about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, where people probably were simply too afraid to say that they support Donald Trump. And so they simply said nothing, or maybe they even said Hillary Clinton when somebody called them, because the way these polls work is someone just randomly calls you, right? So statistically, I mean, I don't disagree in principle. I think there may be some truth to it, nevertheless, due to, the evolutionary environment of cold weather and so on, having to help people more. But potentially, to some degree, there's also some skewed data there.
Yeah.
I mean, potentialities.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably a fear factor. I mean, we're social beings, and we need to, a certain extent, conform to survive. Particularly, when we were growing up, when we were in a tribal society where we depended on the tribe for support, we would have to conform to the cultural norms of that society. Today, we've got, at least in Britain, there's a drive through every public institution, including the schools, in terms of anti-racism training and diversity training. So you've got children who are taught from a young age that to have any resistance to multiculturalism, or to state that perhaps not all cultures and all peoples behave in the same way, is a kind of, I guess you'd say, a thought crime, or is at least immoral, and that may influence their answers to certain roles, or their the attitudes which they feel free to express. And you've also got, kind of de facto suppression of nationalism or nationalist ideas within, within the media. It's quite easy for someone to be doxxed and lose their job, for example, if they do say something that is not entirely favourable to multiculturalism. But you've also got a legal, a legal framework on hate speech and hate crime and other areas.
Certainly in the UK, at least, these things are getting out of control a little bit, almost, right? And I actually wanted to bring up the UK later, but maybe we should sort of conclude on what some of the how you personally judge libertarianism versus nationalism, and what you think the strongest arguments for I've gathered so far that you tend to lean towards ethno-nationalism now, and what you think the strongest arguments really going forward for that are.
Well, I don't think the two are necessarily incompatible. I also don't think that necessarily different people from different ethnic groups can't live together. And so I wouldn't say that I'm entirely ethno-nationalist. I think that there are problems there, because, inevitably when you have a large degree of state control, there's often a large degree of corruption. I do think that a lot of the libertarians, particularly people like Frederick Bastiat, were right when they said that, unbridled sort of state power can lead to damage, and I do think that freedom is, a good goal, or it is a beneficial and moral goal. At the same time, I don't think that that's necessarily going to be achieved in a multicultural society where most people are relatively low IQ and want the violence of the state to be used in their favour. And so I think that ethno-nationalism to a certain extent as a drive towards liberty is kind of required. You would need some kind of ethnically homogenous state in order to achieve freedom.
Right.
That's kind of I guess that's my 2 cents. I'm not. I haven't really come to any total conclusions, and I can't really. I don't think I can go a lot further than that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think we've really covered the topic exhaustively, almost. I guess my question is, I think we only touched on the elite briefly, and this is my final question on the matter. But historically, it certainly appears that nationalism was supportive of the elite. In other words, nationalists would support, Bismarck or the Queen or the King of France. Really, nationalism was synonymous with a sort of militaristic, traditionalist support of the hierarchical structures. Now, I know even today, there are those that advocate for those kind of structures, especially the neo-reactionaries. NRX, I think, pretty much their platform is let's go back to monarchy, right? In not modern monarchy, but old-fashioned monarchy. But I see some contradictions there, because if the nationalism of the past was about supporting the elite, or being essentially, the foot soldier for the elite, being the troops for the elite, being the being in defense of the current status quo, no matter what that was. And of course, that's different depending on the nation. I mean, obviously, the elite in Switzerland had a very different way of dealing with things than, for example, the elite in France or in Norway or in Britain, for that matter. But I guess my question there then is that, since it seems like the majority of the modern ethno-nationalists and those that, conservatives and people that lean libertarian, I mean, I feel like that's a spectrum somehow there that's diametrically opposed to the sort of libertarian, neoliberal, gosh, I mean, these labels, they all don't make any sense anymore, right? But the new left, let's call it that, right? That they are opposed to the elite today, if that makes sense, right? To finally get to the point that I'm trying to make. So those that sort of supported the elite in the past now are in opposition to the elite. And I would argue that a lot of ethno-nationalists, would have huge problems with the Queen, for example, in Britain, because they see, the monarchist as part of the globalist cabal, so to speak, of the elite that's working to destroy their nations, essentially. Are these ethno-nationalists merely trying to replace the elite with their own elite? Or is this going to be a totally different type of nationalism that has a more sort of libertarian tendency, or maybe even a socialist tendency? Because I mean, there is National Socialism as well, right? I guess that's sort of my question. There seems to be a historic break there in what nationalism actually is, or how it expresses itself.
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of practicality. If there was a nationalist resurgence amongst Europe and it became politically powerful, it would be more likely than not be more of a socialist nationalism, largely because working class people tend to be more socialist than free market. So, for example, I mean, most working class people would either see themselves as being socialist to a certain extent, or nationalist. That would probably be the two main divides between working class people. Working class people generally make up the majority of any population.
Right, but I mean that nationalism, historically, at least since the Second World War, has been expressed as conservatism, right? The word nationalism wasn't really used, right? It's the Tories versus Labour. It's in Germany, it's the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, versus the Socialist Party in Germany, I think they're called. Yeah. Right. So the that divide was not named nationalist socialist, at least, was it? Up until now, at least.
I guess so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, I mean, for example, in Britain, the Conservative, yes, it is pro-tradition, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's synonymous with a nationalism. I mean, it's more pro-nation than perhaps the Labour Party is. On the other hand, you know, there have been more nationalist parties which had some success in the polls in the UK previously, like, for example, the British National Party or the National Front. And on the other hand, you've got the UKIP, which is a party that's more goes down the road of more free markets, more libertarian approaches to social structures, but has a civic nationalist drive or tendency as well. So
and the UKIP party is quite interesting because they are somewhat libertarian and they are somewhat nationalist, right?
Yeah.
So that is potentially a uniquely Anglo-Saxon thing, though, because certainly when you get to continental Europe, the population, the working class, skews far more socialist, right, than in America or in England.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So National Socialism again.
Well, I mean, if nationalism was going to be achieved, it would have to be a socialist movement, because most people want socialism. Unfortunately, libertarianism is actually a very niche and quite relatively small in terms of the demographics of people who support it. So
I mean, it's really only because of the United States and the prevalence of libertarianism in the US that it's even known outside of America to any degree. I mean, okay, sure, there was tendencies. It's rooted in Scottish kind of thinking, really, right? Adam Smith, etc. You know, there's that sort of original liberalism, but yeah, it's really only an American phenomenon by and large. I mean, even in Canada, it's fairly weak from my understanding, right? Although it probably does exist there as well. But globally, you know, it's grown mainly due to the internet. So I think you've had sort of these little libertarian cells all over the English-speaking world now that maybe historically didn't exist that much. You know, it's sort of implant from the American way of thinking, right? And as always, language is a bit of a barrier. So, although English is the lingua franca in the world, so you know, there's certainly very good English speakers all over Europe. So I think libertarianism is finding some little cells in, you know, Germany, France, Norway, etc. as well. But it's pretty weak still there. And I always, I have gotten into debates with people in Denmark or Germany, and some of the libertarian ideas that, you know, I do still have are just absolutely shocking to them, right? I mean, when it comes to healthcare and those kind of things.
Yeah.
I don't know what your experience is, but
no, I haven't really debated many people in terms of free market versus socialism or collectivism, but I think we've been brought up in societies where our parents, our schools, the government and the media has generally given you no option but to consider how the violence of the state should be used to benefit certain people, and promoted that idea as that's really the only or the main viable solution to social problems. I mean, other than perhaps charity, but so it's such an alien concept to so many people because they've never been given the opportunity to even to think about it or to consider it as a viable thing, and therefore, because it's so alien, it's immediately sort of received as being immoral and controversial and heartless. You know, that's a key sort of label that's applied to
talk to the hand.
Yeah. So I mean, you know, it's partly indoctrination, I guess. It's partly just a lack of diversity of opinion.
Cool. Well, I mean, that's what this podcast is about, just getting some opinions out there. It's been a really great hour talking to you, and hope there's going to be some comments, questions from the audience. I'd love to do it again.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much.